Being the fourth largest country in the world, Brazil is a very large country in South America. And if we kind of look at it, it also has a different history than all the other countries in South America. The rest of them have a pretty similar history, whereas Brazil is different. So it will get a separate history section. So why was it different? Well, first off, it was colonized not by the Spanish, but by the Portuguese, okay? And the people that came in and took over from Portugal and colonized it were not the same type of refugees as the Spanish people. The Spanish people sent over warriors and soldiers and all that kind of stuff, and they were going to take it by force. Whereas the people that were brought over from Portugal were actually the royal family of Portugal. So what happened there? Why were they leaving their country? Well, in 1807, Napoleon invaded Portugal. And so to keep themselves safe from the French forces and from Napoleon, the royal family of Portugal and about 10,000 of their friends got on ships and went over to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Okay, and so really what ended up happening is this remote capital of Rio de Janeiro, way out in Brazil, became the most important town in the empire of Portugal. Okay, and so very quickly it got taken over, and it wasn't just the regular person, it was the fancy people, the rich people that came over. And so the way that Brazil became Portugal's was through the Treaty of Tordesillas. And what happened, the whole story is that the Pope was trying to keep these Catholic countries from fighting each other over which land in the Americas they would get. And so he decided that he was going to set up this line right here that I'm drawing right now as the line between what Portugal got and what Spain got. And so anything to the east would have been given to Portugal. Anything to the west of that would have been given to Spain. And so essentially that would keep those two countries from fighting against each other. However, they didn't really like that one as much, that line, and they decided that they would argue it out, and in 1494 they came up with this other line right here that is the Treaty of Tordesillas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas says that this line, 46 degrees west, anything west of it belongs to Spain, anything east of it belongs to Portugal. So Portugal got a lot of area in Africa, but it also got Brazil as its lone American country. Okay, and so they began to colonize Brazil and send people over there to live in Brazil. So early on, like most economies, it was an export economy. An export economy means its entire economy, all the money they made was based on selling things, selling the resources that they were grabbing from Brazil to other countries, and most of those countries were over in Europe. So you take those untouched resources and you sell them off. And one of the major exports at this time was something called Brazil wood, and Brazil wood is unique because it is wood. I mean, it's a tree, and this is a picture of a Brazil wood tree, but you don't really use it to build houses with or anything like that. As you can see, it's more of kind of like a bush. There's not much actual wood to it, and so they traded with the natives, and they figured out that it was a wood that produced a red dye. And so it was a really, really good substitute for the other red dyes that happened, and it made a really nice vivid red. And so Brazil started to export this Brazil wood over to Portugal, and Portugal could make nice red clothing and red cloth and all that kind of stuff. And so the name of the country was named after these trees, these Brazil wood trees. Eventually it moved into sugarcane being a more popular item, and the kind of sugarcane farms took a whole lot of work, and so of course they needed somebody to do that work. So they first tried out native slaves, and those native slaves, again, we've heard this story before, either ran away back to their tribes or died, a lot of them. And so they switched over to African slaves that they stole from Africa, essentially. And so Brazil had many, many, many slaves. There were about 10 million slaves in the total of all of America, and out of that, Brazil had, I'll write it up here, 3 to 4 million of those slaves. So between 30 and 40% of all the slaves in South America and North America were in Brazil. And so the African culture was really prominent, and it shaped the traditions of Brazil. So again, going back to the story, the Portuguese royal family ran away from Napoleon in 1807, and they governed their empire from Rio and Rio de Janeiro. And so eventually it got safe again, and when the English defeated Napoleon, and the king went back in 1821, but his son, this man right here, Pedro the First, he stayed in Brazil. And what he did is he said, well, he waited till his dad was gone, and then he sent him a letter and said, guess what? I am the emperor of now independent Brazil. So in 1822, he said, we're now no longer part of Portugal, and I am in charge over here. And so, of course, this father, the king, that went back and his son now said that he was taking over, he let him do it because it was his son. And so it was a very peaceful way of transitioning from being part of Portugal to being their own independent country, with Pedro the First being the leader. At this time, the exports started to change and the economy started to change and become less focused on sugar and a little bit more focused on coffee. And so coffee became the major export in the mid 1800s, and this type of crop was really interesting because it was kind of a boom and a bust crop. It would either be doing really well or not doing well at all. And so late in the 1800s, the emperors really favored the sugar plantation owners in the north. However, coffee was getting to be a really, really powerful export because the people were getting a whole lot of money, and every time you get more money, you get more power in the government, in society, and everywhere. And so these coffee growers wanted a couple things. They wanted a republic. They wanted to be able to vote for their leaders so that the people with power could get more power and not just have the sugar people get all the power. And they also were abolitionists, so they wanted slavery to end. They didn't need it for their coffee farms, and they thought it was inhuman and a wrong thing to do. And so they were campaigning to free the slaves at all. And so in 1889, almost the very end of the 1800s, there was a military coup. And a coup is to overthrow the government. I know it looks like coup, but that word is coup. Okay, military coup to overthrow the government. And they did that. The military came in, took over the government, and they put a republic in place. And so the republic meant that people voted for their leaders. And they made a constitution that was kind of loosely based on the USA. And they set up a government kind of like ours, where they have a federal system, meaning they have one bigger government and then smaller governments underneath them. And they also had a president like we do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Republic. First off, the presidents at this time and throughout a lot of time were called the coffee presidents because the power kind of shifted from those sugar growers over to these coffee growers. Okay, and so the power center kind of shifted from the northern part of Brazil where the sugar growers were down to the southern part where the coffee growers were. And so there were some challenges during the coffee president's times. The worldwide demand for rubber went down. And again, the Amazon is the main area, the biggest exporter of rubber in the world. And so that Amazon area was not making as much money, but the coffee kept the economy going during that time. So it was bad, but it was okay because they still had the coffee. And then the Great Depression hit in 1929, and the entire world was hit by this Great Depression. It became much poorer than it was before. And of course, when you are poorer and you have to make decisions between food and buying coffee, well, coffee is non-essential. You don't need coffee to live. And so a lot of people didn't want to buy coffee anymore, and the prices went way, way down to try and get them to buy it. And so all of a sudden, the country of Brazil wasn't making very much money off of their number one export of coffee. And so these challenges were happening, and people were unhappy with the government, and so a dictator emerged, a Cadillo, and we'll talk about him on the next slide. His name was Getulio Vargas, and Getulio Vargas was a Cadillo, or a dictator, okay, and what he did is he really appealed to, and people liked him, that were workers in the cities, because he wanted to encourage different type of thing. He didn't want just one export, he wanted them to be more diverse. And so he encouraged manufacturing, and he said if we can make our own stuff here, then we won't need other countries near as much. We can reduce how dependent we are on foreigners. Okay, and so that was a good plan. But what he did bad, the bad part about Getulio Vargas, is when you're an emperor, you're stifling democracy, you're taking away democracy, you're taking away people's rights to vote. Okay, and so here's some positive changes that he did make. He did give women voting rights. Also, during his time, he decided he wanted to develop the interior. He wanted to develop the middle part of Brazil where not many people lived. And so he built highways into there and built a new capital in Brasilia, which is a modern capital, a very interesting looking city. And so but again, not all good, because he was a dictator, so there were thousands of people arrested for going against and speaking against the government policies that he had set up, because he could make any decisions. There was no protections. And so in 1990, people end up getting upset, and a democracy was restored, and they brought back democracy. And again, that was not that long ago. That was only 28 years ago that democracy was brought back to Brazil. Now we'll talk about the rest of the countries in South America. We're done with the Brazil section, and we're going to talk about the natives first. And the natives, again, same group of people who came over from Asia, crossed that land bridge, and filtered down all through North America, and then across the isthmus into South America. And so a couple of groups of natives, the first ones are the Pampas. And Pampa were hunter and gatherers. They moved around from place to place to get the food that they needed. And they kind of lived in the grasslands that we now call the Pampas. Okay, and so the grasslands are named after them because that's mainly where they lived. The Incas, however, were a much bigger civilization, and they lived in the Andes. They lived all throughout the Andes, from Ecuador all the way down to Chile. And they had some smaller tribes, and they started to settle and started to farm, and those tribes turned into villages, and those villages turned into cities, and the cities turned into a really big empire. It was actually the biggest empire in America. I mean, it was the largest one of all of them, with cities like Machu Picchu, major cities, all throughout it. And so the Incas were named after their king, and their king was called the Inca. And the Inca was worshipped not only as a king, but also as a god. And so the Spanish came in, and they decided, they saw some and heard rumors and saw some Incan gold and silver, because it was a very rich tribe. And they thought, we need to find a way to get in there. We need to find a way to take that gold and silver and take over these people. The person put in charge of this was Francisco Pizarro, and Francisco Pizarro was put in charge of taking over the largest empire in North and South America, and he was supposed to do it with 180 men. This gold-rich empire, he was supposed to take the whole thing over with 180 men, and he did it. We know that. We know that there's Spanish heritage in South America, and so how did he do it? How did he win? First off, he used surprise. He tricked the Inca at that time, the leader, the king, Atahualpa, and he brought him in, and under the idea that he was going to speak with him. And so Atahualpa went to visit Pizarro's camp, and Pizarro and his men attacked the group that was with Atahualpa, and they killed many of them, and they ended up getting to capture Atahualpa. All right, and so and then they took him in front of his people and executed him publicly in front of them. And so basically, when you think about it, if Atahualpa was seen as a god, they just executed a god in front of them. And so that made them a very, very scary and formidable group of people. They also had cavalry, which made their troops much faster than any native troops. No natives had ever seen a horse. They didn't know what a horse was. And now these men were in here, and they were fighting on top of horses, making them faster and more powerful than if they were just walking against it. And they also had much deadlier weapons, so the Europeans had steel swords that they could easily break through any spears or anything that were made by the natives, and they also had cannons. I mean, they had gunpowder to use, which was not known in South America. The last thing and the most effective thing that helped Pizarro win was European disease, and he didn't even necessarily mean to do it. And so they brought with them European disease that they had immunities to, and the natives, the Inca, didn't have those same immunities because they had been disconnected for so many thousands of years from Europe, and so the European disease ended up killing over 90% of the people, of the natives, Incas in South America. With the Spanish in charge, there were a couple of different groups that were kind of the leaders of it, really, and those were the viceroys and the Catholic Church themselves. The viceroys were the governors of the land, so they were the actual people put in charge of the government. But also the Catholic Church was kind of put in charge of the religion part, and they were sent out to try and convert people into being Catholic from whatever they were before, mostly native religions. Within these nations, there was also slavery used, not as much as Brazil, but there was slavery used all throughout these nations. And of course, they all started with natives and eventually realized that wasn't going to work and switched over to importing people from Africa to be slaves. Now, they had a class system that was completely based on race, and so we'll need to kind of learn these and understand what they are. But the Peninsulares are the first one, and the Peninsulares are people with a Spanish dad and a Spanish mom that were born in Spain, and so you had to have both parents be Spanish, and you had to actually be born over there to be part of this class. And this was the ruling class. This is the only people that were allowed to be viceroys, the only people that were allowed to be in charge. Now, the Criollos, the only difference was you still had a Spanish mom, you still had a Spanish dad, but you were born in South America or the Americas and not born in Spain. And so these people that were just the exact same ethnicity as the Peninsulares were seen as lower class just because of where they were born, and they didn't like that, and it seemed unfair to them. Now, below them were mestizos, and mestizos, it's a picture of mestizos. Okay, this guy would be a Criollo because he's a Spanish guy born there. The daughter would be a mestizo. A mestizo is a mix between white and native, and then the natives and the African slaves were the lowest class. And so the Peninsulares had the most power, and the natives and African slaves had the least power, and it went down kind of in steps. Peninsulares, Criollos, mestizos, natives, and African slaves. Spain was completely in control of their economy, and they controlled the economy of these South American countries. Well, I guess they were colonies at that point, with mercantilism. And mercantilism means that you have to trade your raw goods, not with anybody, but only with your home country for manufactured goods. And so that's the definition of mercantilism, when you have to only trade with your home country. And in this case, the home country was Spain. So you could only trade with Spain, not any other countries. And these countries couldn't even trade with each other. So Venezuela couldn't trade with Colombia. Colombia couldn't trade with Argentina, right? They were only allowed to trade with Spain. And they also discouraged, and sorry, that's a typo there, but they discouraged manufacturing. They said, no, you don't need factories. And the reason they didn't want them to have factories is because what that would do is allow them to make their own goods, and so they wouldn't have to buy anything from Spain. The people in Spain wanted all the money to have to go through there. They wanted to make as much money as possible. And again, like we said before, the Peninsulares had really all the real power. And so the Criollos didn't like that. They said, we're the same as you. Just because we're born somewhere else doesn't make us worse. And they thought it was unfair. They thought it limited the economy. They thought it limited their freedom, and they just didn't like it. And they saw the French Revolution as the French were taking over from their previous government. The American Revolution, where the Americans were getting out from under the thumb of England. And they decided, maybe we should do something like that. So Simon Bolivar started the fighting in the north. We already talked about him starting in Venezuela, the man who freed Latin America. He fought for 20 years working his way south. However, the south needed someone to fight as well. The man that stepped up and fought in the south was the man by the name of Jose de San Martin, and this is a picture of him. But what he did is he started out in Argentina, and so he fought for Argentina's independence first. As soon as he had the independence of Argentina and had defeated the Spanish there, he knew that as long as Spain was still on the continent, as long as Spain was still on South America anywhere, they would want Argentina back because it was very, very valuable land. And so what he decided to do was continue fighting until Spain was completely wiped out so they wouldn't come back and take over. And so he went over the mountains and fought to free Chile and then pushed him and his army into Peru, and he attacked Lima, Peru to try and free that last country. When this happened in Peru, the Battle of Ayacucho happened, and the Battle of Ayacucho freed Peru. And the way that it worked is the Spanish were in this area, and from the south came Jose de San Martin to attack them, and at the same time, Simón Bolívar came from the north, and they kind of they surrounded and destroyed these royalist forces. And so this was really the last battle, the final battle that got South America completely free from Spain. And then Jose de San Martin said after this, but when they were trying to decide who should be the leader, he said that he was going to retire because the presence of a successful soldier is dangerous to the states that have just been created. So basically saying if you put a soldier in charge, they're going to use their power badly. They're going to become a dictator, and that's not a good thing. And so Jose de San Martin was correct, because as soon as he retired and they got their independence, military men took over and took control, and this turned into a big mess where there was this huge gap between the rich people and the poor people, and very few people were middle class. There were just really, really rich people and really, really poor people. And it turned into oligarchies where this small group of military men was holding all of the power. These rich people were holding all of the power. And those people made sure that people from other ethnicities, other ethnic groups, couldn't vote. So they were only letting white Europeans vote and not letting natives or mestizos or anything like that. The oligarchies eventually turned into caudillos. And again, remember, caudillo is a dictator. It's a Spanish word for a dictator. And the first caudillo was Juan Manuel de Rosas, and he was in Argentina, and the people that supported him were the gauchos, or the cowboys. Okay, and they were the most powerful, richest people in Argentina. And so what he did with his power and with his military is he pushed the natives out of the pampas and started to establish ranching. So he started to take that land and force the natives to either move or die. So really he was kind of like the Andrew Jackson of Argentina, pushing the natives off of their land. Then economic opportunity started to be seen, especially from the southern cone. And it's called the southern cone because if you look at South America, there's a picture right here. Okay, if you look at South America, it kind of looks like an ice cream cone, where this bottom part is the actual cone itself, and the top part is the ice cream. Okay, and so the southern cone is this cone part, and it's really a very powerful part of South America because it's where most of the farming and food is created there. And so they started to export from the southern cone food to Europe and the United States, and Italian and Spanish people came in to take advantage of this opportunity to become very, very rich. And so the countries down there, especially Argentina, and Uruguay became very, very white countries, and so they're very European. The people that are there look like they're from a country in Europe. And so that happened with the southern cone. And then we're going to look at Peru, and in Peru, which is this country right here, there were sugar plantations and mines that really started to move really, really well, and they brought in Asian immigrants from China and Japan who allowed those mines and sugar plantations become even more successful and make even more money for them. The last thing that happened is with Bolivia, and Bolivia is the country that's highlighted in red on that map. Okay, and so what ended up happening is Bolivia and Peru were Bolivia actually owned quite a bit more land, and I'll kind of color in where the extra land that Bolivia owned. They owned all of that all the way to the water, and so they were a pretty successful country. But what they wanted is part of Chile. What they couldn't agree on is Chile said, you know what, this is where we get to do our mining, and Bolivia was trying to say, no, this is where we get to do our mining, and Peru was trying to do the same thing. They were all fighting over this piece of land. And so what happened is Peru and Bolivia joined together and attacked Chile. Chile ended up beating Peru and Bolivia, and Bolivia had to make a treaty, and in that treaty, Bolivia lost all of that land that, of course, I have in purple. They lost that in the treaty. And so since then, because they have no real big access to the ocean, no navigation, no access to water, anything like that, they're still probably the poorest region in this, or sorry, poorest nation in this entire region. And so eventually the export boom did end, and when the export boom ended and people weren't buying stuff from them anymore, the economies were really hurt very bad. They weren't able to sell their natural resources anymore, and so they decided they needed to find a way to make their own goods, and that means you have to go through an industrial revolution. You have to go through industrialization, and industrialization means you're turning yourself into a manufacturing nation. You now have factories that can take your natural resources and make them into the things that your people are going to use. And anytime a country goes through industrialization, they usually have a population shift, and people move from rural areas to urban areas. They move from the country to the cities and fill up the cities. And so the power and influence of the urban workers started to grow. And so they started to elect leaders that were going to fit with them. And so in Argentina, Juan Perón, this man right here, was elected. And in Chile, it was Salvador Allende. And Salvador Allende and Juan Perón had very similar policies. They both tried to nationalize industry, so have the country, the government, take control of industry and take some of the land from the rich and give it to the poor, redistribute that land. And another person that was very popular was Eva Perón. Eva Perón was Juan's wife, and she worked a lot to improve the rights of workers and women in Argentina in particular. And so the next step with these leaders starting to nationalize and the government taking control and everything is people started to get really afraid of communism. And so this fear of communism, this fear of socialism made the military again take control. And when the military took control, they set up some really brutal regimes. And so in Chile in 1973, the military took control and they ended free speech. They didn't allow people to say whatever they wanted about the government. They would be punished. They would oftentimes be put in jail or murdered. Literally tens of thousands of their opponents who spoke out against the Chilean government got killed, got murdered. Okay, so it wasn't an easy thing. And in Argentina, the same thing happened. And again, they murdered more than 10,000 people who spoke out against them. And in Argentina, they also had secret prisons and torture centers taken or set up that they would take these people away to without letting anybody know and torture them until they admitted to doing whatever they assumed that they were doing. And so literally it got so bad into the 1980s that mothers would come that had lost their kids to these secret torture prisons and centers and stuff like that, and they held protests in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, literally every week saying, let our kids free, let us speak, let us say what we want. And so eventually in the 1980s, people got tired of it and they started to threaten to overthrow the government, overthrow this military regime. So the military needed to find a way to get confidence back in them and get their power back. And so in Argentina, they decided we're going to invade the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands are a small group of islands off the southern part of South America. And they thought if we can go out there and we can take this area that's owned by Great Britain, then we'll bring the nation back together. They wanted to unite the nation, get everyone back on their sides. However, they were pretty much really quickly and really easily beaten in military by Great Britain, and so Great Britain defeated them, and the military was completely embarrassed, and they lost all of their power and lost all of their respect from the people, and so the people took back over. And so in the late 80s, the democracy did return to Argentina.